I'm Jessica Martinez, 28 years old, and I never imagined my own parents would steal my home from under my feet. When I discovered they had secretly mortgaged my house for $200,000, I thought it was some kind of mistake. I never expected to find myself standing before a judge while my father shouted that I was an ungrateful daughter who owed them everything, and my mother crying that I was destroying our family over money. The judge's response left everyone in that courtroom speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, I always thought I had the perfect family. My parents, Bob and Linda Martinez, were the kind of people who attended every school event, cheered at my soccer games, and made sure our small apartment in Tempe always felt like home. Dad worked construction for 30 years, his hands permanently stained with calluses and concrete dust, while Mom juggled part-time jobs to help make ends meet. We weren't wealthy, but we were rich in love and support, or so I believed. My childhood was filled with weekend trips to Papago Park, where Dad would grill burgers while Mom packed elaborate picnic spreads. They taught me the value of hard work, the importance of education, and above all, that family always came first. When I expressed interest in joining the military after high school, they supported my decision even though it meant I'd be stationed far from home. Dad would say with pride in his voice that his daughter was serving her country, and Mom would send care packages filled with homemade cookies and handwritten letters every month. My 4 years in the Army shaped me in ways I never expected. I learned discipline, responsibility, and most importantly, I discovered I had a natural talent for logistics and organization. When my service ended, I returned to Phoenix with the GI Bill in hand and a clear vision for my future. I enrolled at Arizona State University to study business marketing, working part-time jobs to supplement my benefits while living with my parents to save money. The transition back to civilian life wasn't always smooth, but my parents were my anchor. Dad would wait up for me when I had late study sessions, always ready with leftover dinner and stories about his day. Mom helped me navigate the bureaucracy of veteran benefits and college applications with infinite patience. They never made me feel like a burden, even when I knew my presence in their small two-bedroom apartment cramped their style. After graduation, I landed a position as a digital marketing coordinator at Henderson Marketing Solutions, a mid-sized firm in downtown Phoenix. The work was challenging and rewarding, combining my military organizational skills with my newfound passion for creative marketing strategies. My supervisor, Karen, quickly recognized my potential and began giving me increasingly important projects. Within 18 months, I had earned 2 promotions and a salary that finally made me feel financially independent. The real turning point came when I qualified for a VA home loan. For months, I had been secretly browsing real estate listings, dreaming of owning my own place but never quite believing it could happen. When my loan officer explained that I could purchase a home with no down payment, I felt like I was living in a fairy tale. My parents were ecstatic when I shared the news, immediately volunteering to help with house hunting and move preparations. We spent countless weekends driving through different Phoenix neighborhoods, evaluating properties and discussing the pros and cons of each location. Dad's construction background proved invaluable as he assessed foundations, roofing and electrical systems with a practiced eye. Mom focused on the practical aspects, measuring rooms and envisioning how furniture would fit. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and their genuine excitement for my success made the entire process feel like a family celebration. The house I eventually found was a 3-bedroom ranch in Ahwatukee, a quiet neighborhood known for its safety and community feel. Built in 1998, it featured an open floor plan, a 2-car garage, and a backyard perfect for entertaining. The previous owners had maintained it beautifully, with updated appliances and fresh paint throughout. At $385,000, it stretched my budget but remained within the VA loan limits. My parents were present for every step of the purchasing process. Dad insisted on being there for the home inspection, taking detailed notes and asking questions that hadn't occurred to me. Mom accompanied me to the final walkthrough, her eagle eye catching minor issues that needed addressing before closing. When I finally received the keys on a sunny Tuesday morning in March, we all stood in the empty living room with tears in our eyes. The first few months of home ownership were a whirlwind of decorating, landscaping, and settling into new routines. My parents visited frequently, always ready to help with projects or simply enjoy dinner in my new dining room. Dad installed a security system and taught me basic home maintenance skills while Mom helped me choose paint colors and arrange furniture. Their pride in my accomplishment was evident in every conversation, and they never missed an opportunity to tell friends and neighbors about their daughter's beautiful new home. I gave them a spare key shortly after moving in, partly for emergencies and partly because they had been so instrumental in making the purchase possible. They had always been trustworthy with my belongings, and it felt natural to extend that trust to my new home. Dad mentioned that he felt better knowing he could check on the house when I traveled for work, and Mom liked being able to water my plants when I worked late. My social life began to flourish in ways it never had while living with my parents. I hosted dinner parties for colleagues, barbecues for old friends, and quiet movie nights for myself. The house became a gathering place for my social circle, and I took pride in creating a warm, welcoming environment. My parents often joined these gatherings, fitting seamlessly into my friend group and adding their own warmth to the atmosphere. It was during one of these gatherings that I met Mike Thompson, a firefighter who had been dragged along by his friend Sarah, my coworker from Henderson Marketing. Mike was different from the guys I had dated before, steady, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in conversation rather than just making an impression. He had served in the Marines before joining the Phoenix Fire Department, and we bonded over our shared military experience and love for Arizona's outdoor lifestyle. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally. Mike appreciated my independence and never tried to rush things or push for commitments I wasn't ready to make. He got along wonderfully with my parents, often staying after dinner to help Dad with household projects or listen to Mom's stories about her work at Target. Sunday afternoons became a tradition where Mike would join us for backyard barbecues, his easy laugh mixing with Dad's construction stories and Mom's. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Gentle teasing. 6 months into our relationship, Mike moved in with me, splitting expenses and household responsibilities in a way that felt completely natural. He respected my space and independence while adding his own touches to make the house feel like our shared home. My parents were thrilled with the arrangement, often commenting on how happy I seemed and how well suited Mike and I were for each other. Life felt perfectly balanced during this period. My career continued to advance with new responsibilities and corresponding salary increases. Mike and I settled into comfortable routines of work, weekend adventures hiking in the desert, and quiet evenings at home. My relationship with my parents remained close and supportive, with regular dinners and family activities that strengthened our bonds. The only minor concern during this time was my parents' increasing comments about their own housing situation. Their apartment lease was approaching renewal, and they worried about potential rent increases. Dad's retirement was still a few years away, but he had begun expressing anxiety about their long-term financial security. Mom's part-time hours at Target provided limited benefits, and they often discussed their wish for a more permanent housing solution. During family dinners, these conversations became more frequent and detailed. Dad would mention seeing houses for sale in their price range, wondering aloud whether they could qualify for a mortgage at their age. Mom would research senior-friendly communities, sharing brochures and discussing the pros and cons of different locations. I offered to help them explore their options, suggesting they speak with a financial advisor or real estate agent to understand their possibilities. Their gratitude for my offer was touching, but they insisted they needed to figure things out on their own. Dad maintained that he had been handling family finances for 30 years and didn't need help now, while Mom worried about burdening me with their problems. I respected their independence while making it clear that I was available whenever they were ready for assistance. My work life during this period was particularly rewarding. Henderson Marketing had landed several major clients, and I found myself leading teams and managing budgets that would have intimidated me just a year earlier. Karen recommended me for advanced training programs, and I began to envision a future where I might eventually start my own marketing consultancy. The financial stability my house represented gave me confidence to take professional risks and pursue opportunities I might have avoided while renting. Mike's career was also flourishing. He had been selected for specialized training that could lead to promotion within the fire department, and his dedication to community service inspired my own involvement in local veteran support groups. Together we began talking about long-term plans, including the possibility of marriage and children. The house felt like the perfect foundation for building a future together. My parents seemed genuinely happy during this period, celebrating our successes and participating enthusiastically in our plans. Dad had begun talking about potential grandchildren, joking about converting my spare bedroom into a nursery someday. Mom had started collecting recipes she wanted to teach me. Traditional family dishes that represented our cultural heritage. Their involvement in my life felt supportive rather than intrusive, and I considered myself incredibly fortunate to have such loving, engaged parents. The first hint that something might be amiss came during a casual conversation about home values in my neighborhood. I had mentioned that similar houses were selling for significantly more than I had paid just 2 years earlier, expressing amazement at how quickly real estate prices were rising. Dad's response struck me as oddly specific, as he rattled off exact figures for recent sales and seemed unusually knowledgeable about market trends in my area. When I asked how he knew so much about Ahwatukee real estate, he explained that he had been researching the area for friends who were considering moving nearby. His explanation made sense, but something about his tone seemed forced, almost rehearsed. Mom quickly changed the subject, asking about my work projects with an enthusiasm that felt slightly artificial. I dismissed my concerns as overthinking, attributing Dad's knowledge to his natural curiosity and thorough personality. He had always been detail-oriented, researching purchases extensively before making decisions. Mom's subject change could easily be explained by her genuine interest in my career and her desire to keep conversations positive and engaging. However, over the following weeks, I began noticing other small things that seemed unusual. Dad would ask detailed questions about my work schedule, seeming particularly interested in business trips and late evening commitments. Mom inquired about Mike's shift patterns with what felt like excessive curiosity. They also seemed unusually interested in my mail delivery times and whether I had any problems with neighborhood security. These observations remained in the back of my mind without triggering serious concern. My parents had always been protective, and their questions could easily be interpreted as normal parental interest in my safety and well-being. The military had taught me to trust my instincts, but it had also taught me not to jump to conclusions without evidence. The last completely peaceful family gathering occurred in early October, when we celebrated my 28th birthday with a backyard barbecue at my house. Mike had surprised me with a weekend getaway to Sedona, while my parents presented me with a beautiful necklace that had belonged to my grandmother. The afternoon was filled with laughter, good food, and the comfortable conversation that had characterized our family gatherings for years. As we sat around the patio table that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Dad raised his beer in a toast to my success and independence. Mom added her own words about how proud they were of the woman I had become, and Mike squeezed my hand while expressing his gratitude for being welcomed into our family so completely. In that moment, surrounded by the people I loved most in the world, I felt incredibly blessed and secure in my relationships and my future. If only I had known that this perfect evening would be the last time I would feel completely safe and trusting with my parents. The betrayal that was about to unfold would shake the very foundation of everything I believed about family, trust, and the people who claimed to love me most. Part 2. The first crack in paradise. The first real sign that something was wrong came on a cold November morning, when I received an unexpected phone call at work. I was in the middle of reviewing campaign analytics for our biggest client when my phone buzzed with a call from First National Bank. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Jennifer Hayes from the mortgage department, and her tone was professional but concerned. "Miss Martinez, I'm calling about some unusual activity on your home equity account," she said, and I felt my stomach drop immediately. I had never opened a home equity account, and I told her so with growing confusion and alarm. There was a brief pause before she continued. "According to our records, you opened a home equity line of credit 3 weeks ago for $200,000. The funds were disbursed last Friday." The world seemed to tilt sideways as I tried to process what she was telling me. I explained that there had to be some mistake, that I had never applied for any home equity loan, and that I certainly hadn't received any funds. Hayes assured me that she would investigate immediately, and asked if I could come to the bank that afternoon to review the documentation. My hands were shaking as I hung up the phone and immediately called my supervisor to request emergency personal time. The drive to the bank felt surreal, as though I was moving through a bad dream that I couldn't wake up from. I kept telling myself that this was simply a case of mistaken identity, that someone with a similar name had somehow been confused with me in the bank's computer system. These things happened all the time, I reasoned, and it would be sorted out quickly once I provided proper identification and explained the situation. Miss Hayes met me in her office with a thick folder of documents spread across her desk. Her expression was sympathetic but serious as she walked me through the paperwork. There in black and white was my signature on a home equity loan application. The handwriting looked remarkably similar to mine, but something about it felt slightly off, as though someone had been very carefully copying my natural writing style. More disturbing were the supporting documents that had been submitted with the application. Copies of my driver's license, social security card, and recent pay stubs were all there, along with property tax records and the original deed to my house. Everything appeared legitimate, and Miss Hayes explained that the application had been processed without any red flags because all the documentation seemed to be in order. The interesting thing, she continued, is that the funds were transferred to an account at Desert Community Credit Union, not to your checking account here with us. The application specifically requested that arrangement, stating that you were planning to use the money for investment purposes and preferred to keep it separate from your regular banking. I stared at the papers in front of me, feeling like I was looking at evidence of a crime that made no sense. Who had access to all these personal documents? Who knew enough about my financial situation to forge a convincing application? And most importantly, who would do this to me? The list of people with access to this information was extremely short, and the implications of that realization made me feel physically sick. Miss Hayes was clearly experienced in dealing with fraud cases, and she walked me through the next steps with professional efficiency. The bank would immediately freeze the home equity account and begin an internal investigation. I would need to file a police report and dispute the loan with their fraud department. She also recommended that I contact the credit union where the funds had been sent to see if I could gather more information about the account holder. The drive home from the bank was a blur of anxiety and disbelief. I called Mike from my car, and his immediate concern and offer to meet me at home provided the only comfort in an otherwise devastating day. When I pulled into my driveway, the house that had represented security and achievement now felt vulnerable and violated. Someone had used my home as collateral for a loan I had never authorized, and that someone had intimate knowledge of my personal information. Mike arrived within 20 minutes, still in his fire department uniform, and gathered me into his arms as I broke down completely. Through tears I explained everything Miss Hayes had told me, watching his expression shift from confusion to anger as he realized the scope of what had happened. His military background kicked in immediately, and he began asking practical questions about next steps and evidence preservation. "We need to figure out who had access to all those documents," he said grimly. "Your driver's license, social security card, pay stubs, property records, that's not information someone could just find lying around. This was done by someone who either lives here or has been in your house recently, with enough time to photograph or copy everything." The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow. The number of people who had that level of access to my home and personal information could be counted on one hand. Mike himself was the obvious first consideration, but the timeline didn't work. He had been with me or at work during the period when the application would have been submitted. Sarah, my best friend and coworker, had a spare key but had never shown any interest in my financial affairs and certainly didn't need money. That left my parents, the people who had raised me, supported my dreams, and celebrated every milestone in my adult life. The idea that Bob and Linda Martinez could be responsible for this betrayal felt so impossible that my mind rejected it completely. There had to be another explanation, some angle I wasn't considering. Some mistake in the timeline or documentation that would clear them of any involvement. But even as I tried to convince myself of their innocence, uncomfortable memories began surfacing. Dad's unusual knowledge of real estate values in my neighborhood. Their recent conversations about housing and financial security. The specific questions about my work schedule and Mike's shifts. Details that had seemed like normal parental concern now took on a more sinister significance. Mike suggested that we conduct a careful search of my house to see if anything was missing or had been disturbed. We started with my home office, the most likely place where important documents would be stored. My filing cabinet appeared normal at first glance, but as I examined each folder more carefully, I noticed that papers were slightly out of order. Documents that I always kept in chronological sequence had been reshuffled, and some items that should have been in protective sleeves were loose in the folders. Most telling was my fireproof document safe, where I kept my most important papers. The combination lock showed slight scratches around the numbers, suggesting that someone had been experimenting with different combinations. The contents appeared complete, but several items were folded differently than I remembered, and the order was definitely not how I had left it. "Jess," Mike said quietly, holding up a small piece of paper he had found wedged behind the filing cabinet. "Look at this." It was a practice sheet with my signature written multiple times in slightly different styles, as though someone had been perfecting their forgery technique. The handwriting was shaky at first, but became more confident and accurate with each attempt. The discovery of the practice signatures felt like the final piece of evidence I had been dreading. There was no longer any way to deny that someone had deliberately and methodically prepared to steal my identity for the purpose of obtaining this loan. The level of planning and access required pointed unmistakably towards someone I trusted completely, someone who had been in my house repeatedly and recently. My phone rang while we were still processing this discovery, and my heart sank when I saw my mother's name on the display. Her voice was bright and cheerful as she asked about my day and suggested that we all get together for dinner over the weekend. The normalcy of her tone, combined with what I had just discovered, created a surreal cognitive dissonance that left me struggling to respond appropriately. I managed to keep the conversation brief, claiming that I was tired from a busy day at work and would call her back later. After hanging up, I stared at the phone in my hand, wondering if I had just spoken to the person who had violated my trust and stolen from me in the most calculated way imaginable. The woman who had raised me, who had helped me pick out this house, who had a spare key and unlimited access to my personal information. Mike and I spent the rest of the evening researching identity theft and mortgage fraud, trying to understand the legal implications and potential consequences of what had happened. The information we found was both enlightening and terrifying. If the loan couldn't be resolved quickly, I could potentially lose my house. The fraudulent loan was secured by my property, giving the bank legal claim to my home if the debt wasn't satisfied. Even more disturbing was the realization that proving fraud in cases involving family members was notoriously difficult. Banks and law enforcement often assumed that family financial arrangements were consensual, even when documentation suggested otherwise. The burden of proof would be on me to demonstrate that I had not authorized the loan, and the fact that the perpetrator had such detailed access to my personal information would complicate that process. Sleep was impossible that night as my mind raced through every possible scenario and outcome. I found myself analyzing every recent interaction with my parents, searching for clues I might have missed or signs that should have warned me of their intentions. The conversations about their housing situation took on new meaning, and I wondered if they had been planning this for months while sitting at my dinner table and accepting my hospitality. The most painful aspect of the entire situation was the complete destruction of trust that had anchored my understanding of family relationships. My parents had not only stolen from me financially, but they had stolen my sense of security and belonging in the world. The foundation of unconditional love and support that had shaped my identity since childhood was revealed to be an illusion, and I felt completely unmoored from everything I had believed about my life. Morning brought no relief, only the harsh reality of practical steps that needed to be taken. I called in sick to work, knowing that I couldn't concentrate on marketing campaigns while my entire financial future hung in the balance. My first stop was the Phoenix Police Department, where I filed a formal report for identity theft and fraud. The detective assigned to my case was sympathetic but honest about the challenges I would face in proving my innocence when the perpetrator was likely a family member. The next several hours were spent making phone calls to credit reporting agencies, placing fraud alerts on my accounts, and beginning the process of disputing the unauthorized loan. Each conversation required me to explain the situation repeatedly, and each explanation felt like reopening a fresh wound. The customer service representatives were professional but clearly skeptical that someone could obtain such detailed personal information without the account holder's knowledge or cooperation. My visit to Desert Community Credit Union proved to be particularly enlightening and devastating. The account where my loan proceeds had been deposited was opened the same day the funds were transferred, using identification that appeared to belong to my father. The woman who assisted me was reluctant to provide details due to privacy regulations, but she confirmed that the account holder had provided identification matching Robert Martinez and had listed my address as his residence. This revelation eliminated any remaining doubt about my parents' involvement in the fraud. They had not only stolen my identity to obtain the loan, but Dad had used his own identification to open the account where the funds were deposited. The brazenness of using his real name while stealing from his daughter suggested either incredible arrogance or desperate stupidity, and I couldn't decide which possibility was more disturbing. The drive home from the credit union was when the full emotional impact of the betrayal finally hit me. I had to pull over in a parking lot as I was overcome by sobbing that seemed to come from somewhere deep in my chest. The people who had taught me about honesty, integrity, and family loyalty had violated every principle they had instilled in me. They had looked me in the eye over dinner just days earlier, knowing that they had already stolen $200,000 secured by my home. Mike was waiting for me when I returned home, having taken personal time from the fire department to help me navigate this crisis. His steady presence and practical support were keeping me functional when I wanted to curl up in bed and pretend this wasn't happening. Together we began making lists of everyone who needed to be contacted and every step that needed to be taken to protect my financial future and prove my innocence. The hardest decision was whether to confront my parents directly or let the legal process play out without giving them advance warning. Part of me wanted to call them immediately and demand explanations, while another part recognized that any contact could complicate the criminal investigation and potentially give them time to hide evidence or fabricate justifications for their actions. Mike advocated for involving law enforcement before making any direct contact, arguing that my parents had already demonstrated their willingness to deceive me and couldn't be trusted to be honest even if confronted with evidence. His perspective was logical, but it felt like another layer of betrayal to treat my own parents as criminal suspects rather than family members who might have made a terrible mistake. That evening, I received a text message from my mother asking if I wanted to join them for dinner at their favorite Mexican restaurant. The casual normalcy of the invitation, sent just hours after I had spent the day discovering the extent of their theft, created a surreal juxtaposition that left me staring at my phone in disbelief. How could they maintain such ordinary interactions while knowing what they had done? Did they assume I would never discover the fraud, or were they simply compartmentalizing their crime as separate from our family relationship? I showed the text to Mike, who shook his head in amazement at their audacity. They're either incredible actors or they've completely convinced themselves that what they did was justified, he said. Either way, you need to be very careful about how you respond. Anything you say could potentially be used against you later if they claim you knew about the loan all along. The weight of having to strategize my response to my own mother's dinner invitation felt like another violation of the parent-child relationship I had cherished. These were people who should have been my first call in a crisis, my source of comfort and advice when facing difficult decisions. Instead, they had become the crisis, and I was forced to treat them as potential threats to my financial and legal security. As I sat in my living room that night, surrounded by documents and legal paperwork, I looked around at the house that had represented independence and achievement just 2 days earlier. Now it felt like a crime scene, a place where my most trusted relationships had been revealed as elaborate deceptions. The home that was supposed to be my sanctuary had become the instrument of my betrayal, used as collateral for theft I was only beginning to understand. The realization that this was just the beginning of a long and painful process was almost overwhelming. Proving fraud, recovering the stolen money, and protecting my house would require months of legal proceedings and documentation. But even more daunting was the prospect of rebuilding my understanding of family, trust, and the fundamental relationships that had shaped my entire worldview. Part 3: Unraveling the Web of Deception. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything about how I understood the scope of my parents' betrayal. Detective Maria Santos from the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit called to inform me that my case had been assigned to her and that preliminary investigations had revealed additional concerning information about the Desert Community Credit Union account where my loan proceeds had been deposited. Martinez, Detective Santos said in a professional but compassionate tone, "We've been working with the credit union to trace the movement of funds from your home equity loan. What we've discovered suggests that this may not be an isolated incident. The account your father opened has been used for several large transactions over the past month, and we're finding connections to other financial irregularities that predate your loan by several weeks." She explained that my parents had apparently been planning this fraud for much longer than I had realized. The credit union account had been opened 6 weeks before my loan was processed, and during that time they had been making smaller deposits and withdrawals that appeared designed to establish a transaction history and avoid triggering automatic fraud detection systems. This level of premeditation made their betrayal feel even more calculated and deliberate. Detective Santos requested that I come to the station that afternoon to provide a detailed statement and review additional evidence they had gathered. She also mentioned that they would likely need to interview my parents within the next few days, and she wanted to prepare me for the possibility that our conversation might prompt them to contact me directly once they realized they were under investigation. The drive to the police station felt like crossing a bridge into territory I had never imagined visiting. Growing up, the police were the good guys who helped people and kept communities safe. I had never considered that I might someday be sitting in an interview room as the victim of a crime committed by my own family members. The institutional fluorescent lighting and formal procedures created an atmosphere that made the situation feel both more real and more surreal. Detective Santos was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. She had clearly handled many cases involving family financial fraud, and her questions were designed to establish not just the facts of what had happened, but also the emotional and relational context that would be important for understanding the full scope of the crime. I need you to walk me through your relationship with your parents over the past 6 months, she said, pulling out a legal pad and preparing to take detailed notes. Were there any changes in their behavior, any unusual requests for information, any conversations about money or housing that seemed out of character or particularly focused? As I began recounting the subtle shifts I had noticed in my parents' behavior, patterns emerged that I hadn't fully recognized while they were happening. Detective Santos took careful notes as I described Dad's unusual interest in real estate values, their specific questions about my work schedule, and the increasing frequency of conversations about their own housing insecurity. What's particularly concerning, Detective Santos explained, is that this appears to have been a sophisticated operation rather than an impulsive decision. The timeline suggests they spent weeks gathering information, practicing your signature, and establishing the financial infrastructure needed to receive and conceal the stolen funds. This wasn't a desperate grab for quick money, it was a calculated plan to systematically defraud you. She showed me copies of bank surveillance footage from Desert Community Credit Union, and seeing my father's face on the security camera as he opened the fraudulent account felt like a punch to the stomach. There he was, the man who had taught me to ride a bike and walked me down the aisle at my high school graduation, calmly conducting financial business using money stolen from his daughter's home equity. Even more disturbing was additional footage showing both my parents at the credit union 3 days after the loan funds were deposited. They appeared relaxed and confident as they conducted transactions, showing no signs of guilt or anxiety about what they had done. Mom was even smiling and chatting with the teller, as though this was a perfectly normal banking visit rather than the management of proceeds from identity theft. Detective Santos explained that investigators had also discovered that my parents had used portions of the stolen money to pay off significant debts that I had been completely unaware of. Dad owed nearly $30,000 in gambling debts to various casinos around Phoenix, while Mom had accumulated substantial credit card debt through what appeared to be compulsive shopping. The home equity loan proceeds had been used to satisfy these obligations, leaving them with approximately $120,000 in remaining funds. The debt situation helps explain their motivation, Detective Santos continued, but it also complicates the recovery process. They've already spent a significant portion of the stolen money to pay legitimate creditors, which means those funds may be difficult or impossible to recover. The remaining money appears to be sitting in investment accounts and a separate savings account, but will need court orders to freeze those assets. This information added another layer of betrayal to an already devastating situation. Not only had my parents stolen from me, but they had been living double lives for months or possibly years. The financial stress they had been experiencing was far more severe than they had ever let on, and rather than asking for help or finding legitimate solutions, they had chosen to victimize their own daughter. I asked Detective Santos about the likelihood of criminal charges being filed against my parents, and her response was both reassuring and sobering. The evidence is quite strong for multiple felony charges including identity theft, mortgage fraud, and grand theft. However, prosecuting family members for financial crimes can be complicated by emotional factors and the victim's willingness to cooperate with prosecution efforts. She explained that many adult children who are victimized by their parents ultimately choose not to pursue criminal charges either out of misplaced loyalty or fear of destroying family relationships. In some cases, this reluctance to prosecute actually enables continued criminal behavior, as offending parents learn that they can exploit their children's love and guilt to escape consequences for their actions. I want you to understand that this decision is entirely yours to make, Detective Santos said firmly. But I also want you to consider the broader implications of your choice. If your parents face no legal consequences for this theft, they may be emboldened to target you again in the future, or they may victimize other family members or individuals. Criminal prosecution serves not just to punish wrongdoing but to prevent future crimes. The weight of this responsibility felt enormous. The decision about whether to pursue criminal charges against my parents would affect not just my own recovery process, but potentially their freedom and future. It would also send a message to my extended family and community about what behavior was acceptable within family relationships and what consequences would follow serious violations of trust. I left the police station that afternoon with more information than I had wanted and a decision-making burden that felt almost unbearable. Detective Santos had given me several days to consider my options before they would need to move forward with formal charges, but she had also made it clear that the investigation would continue regardless of my personal preferences about prosecution. Mike was waiting for me at home with dinner and the kind of steady emotional support that was keeping me grounded during this nightmare. As I shared what I had learned from Detective Santos, I watched his expression shift from sympathy to anger to a kind of protective determination that reminded me why I had fallen in love with him in the first place. "Jess, I know they're your parents, and this is incredibly painful," he said after I had finished explaining everything Detective Santos had told me. "But you need to think about what message you send if you let them get away with this. They didn't just steal money from you, they've potentially destroyed your financial future and put your house at risk. That's not something you do to someone you love, even if you're desperate." His words echoed my own thoughts, but hearing them from someone else made them feel more real and immediate. Mike had no family loyalty clouding his judgment, and his perspective was based purely on the facts of what had been done to me and what justice should look like in response. His clarity helped cut through some of the emotional confusion that was making this decision so difficult. That evening, I decided to call my best friend Sarah to get another outside perspective on the situation. Sarah had known my parents for years and had always spoken fondly of them, but she had also seen the aftermath of their betrayal firsthand over the past few days. Her response to the news about the gambling debts and credit card problems was immediate and uncompromising. "Jessica, this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a desperate mistake," she said firmly. "This was a deliberate, planned attack on your financial security by people who were supposed to protect you. The fact that they were hiding major financial problems while stealing from you makes it even worse. They weren't just taking advantage of your trust, they were actively deceiving you about their situation while plotting to make you pay for their mistakes." Sarah's anger on my behalf was both comforting and clarifying. She helped me understand that my parents' financial difficulties, while potentially explaining their motivation, did not excuse or justify their decision to victimize me. Plenty of people face financial stress without resorting to stealing from their children, and my parents' choice to handle their problems through fraud was a reflection of their character rather than their circumstances. The conversation with Sarah also helped me recognize how much my sense of family loyalty was being manipulated by people who had shown no corresponding loyalty to me. They had violated every principle they had taught me about honesty, integrity, and responsibility, yet my immediate instinct was still to protect them from the consequences of their choices. This misplaced guilt was exactly the kind of emotional manipulation that enabled financial abuse within families. As the evening wore on, I found myself thinking about other family members who might be affected by criminal prosecution of my parents. My elderly grandparents adored their son and daughter-in-law and would be devastated to learn about their crimes. Several cousins maintained close relationships with my parents and would likely blame me for destroying the family unity they valued. The ripple effects of pursuing justice would extend far beyond my immediate relationship with Bob and Linda Martinez. But I also realized that my failure to hold them accountable would send equally damaging messages to these same family members. It would suggest that financial abuse was acceptable within our family as long as it was committed by parents against children. It would teach younger relatives that family loyalty meant accepting criminal victimization without resistance. Most importantly, it would enable my parents to potentially victimize others in the future with the knowledge that family connections would protect them from meaningful consequences. The internal struggle between family loyalty and personal justice kept me awake most of the night, but by morning I had reached a decision that felt both difficult and necessary. I would cooperate fully with the criminal prosecution of my parents, not out of vindictiveness or anger, but because it was the only response that acknowledged the seriousness of what they had done and the importance of preventing future victimization. I called Detective Santos first thing in the morning to inform her of my decision and to ask about the next steps in the process. She seemed relieved by my choice and explained that they would be executing search warrants on my parents' apartment and financial records within the next 48 hours. She also warned me that my parents would likely contact me once they realized they were under investigation, and she provided guidance on how to handle those conversations without compromising the case. It's natural that they'll try to appeal to your emotions and family loyalty once they understand the legal consequences they're facing. Detective Santos explained, they may apologize, make promises to pay the money back, or try to convince you that prosecution will hurt you more than it helps. Remember that these are the same people who looked you in the eye for weeks while stealing from you. Their sudden remorse is more likely motivated by fear of consequences than genuine regret for their actions. Her warning proved prophetic. Less than 2 hours after our conversation, I received a frantic phone call from my mother. Her voice was shaky and desperate as she explained that police officers had just left their apartment after executing a search warrant, and that Dad had been asked to come to the station for questioning the following morning. "Jessica, honey, I don't understand what's happening," she said, her words tumbling over each other in obvious panic. "The police said something about fraud and identity theft, and they took our computer and some financial papers. They mentioned your name and said you had filed a report. What is this about? What have you told them?" The performance was almost convincing, and for a moment I felt my resolve wavering in the face of my mother's apparent confusion and distress. But then I remembered the bank surveillance footage showing both my parents calmly conducting business with my stolen money, and I realized that this bewildered innocence was just another layer of manipulation. "Mom, you know exactly what this is about," I said as calmly as I could manage. "You and Dad took out a home equity loan using my house as collateral without my knowledge or permission. You forged my signature and used my personal documents to steal $200,000. The police have evidence of everything, including surveillance footage of Dad opening the account where you deposited the money." The silence that followed lasted so long that I wondered if she had hung up. When she finally spoke, the pretense of confusion was gone, replaced by a tone I had never heard from her before, cold, calculating, and completely devoid of the maternal warmth I had known my entire life. "Jessica, you need to understand that we were trying to secure our family's future," she said with an edge of desperation masked as righteous indignation. "Your father worked for 30 years to provide for this family, and now we're facing retirement with nothing. We weren't stealing from you, we were borrowing against your house to create investments that would benefit all of us eventually. You're young and successful with a good job and a house. We needed help, and you would have said no if we had asked directly." This justification was so twisted and self-serving that I felt my remaining sympathy for their situation evaporate completely. They had convinced themselves that stealing from me was actually an act of family financial planning, and that my likely refusal to voluntarily put my house at risk somehow justified taking that choice away from me entirely. "Mom, what you did was not borrowing, it was theft," I replied firmly. "You put my house at risk without my knowledge or consent. You lied to me for weeks while planning and executing this fraud. You used my personal documents and forged my signature on legal papers. These are serious crimes, and they have nothing to do with family loyalty or financial planning." Her response revealed the depth of their self-deception and the complete absence of genuine remorse for their actions. Rather than acknowledging the criminal nature of their behavior or expressing concern for the harm they had caused me, she launched into a litany of justifications focused on their financial needs and their belief that I owed them support in their retirement years. "After everything we've done for you, raising you, supporting your dreams, helping you buy that house, this is how you repay us," she said, her voice rising with emotion that sounded more like anger than regret. "We sacrificed for years to give you opportunities, and now, when we need help, you call the police on your own parents. What kind of daughter does that?" The emotional manipulation was so blatant and so divorced from the reality of what they had done that I felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of who my parents really were. The people who had raised me were capable of love and support, but they were also capable of calculated deception and criminal behavior when it served their purposes. Most importantly, they were capable of victimizing me while simultaneously demanding gratitude for the privilege. I ended the phone call without making any commitments about dropping charges or refusing to cooperate with the investigation. My mother's final words were a threat disguised as a plea. "If you go through with this prosecution, you'll destroy our family and ruin any chance we have of working this out together. Think carefully about whether that's really what you want." The conversation left me emotionally drained but intellectually clearer about the righteousness of my decision to pursue criminal charges. My parents had shown no genuine remorse for their actions, no concern for the harm they had caused me, and no willingness to take responsibility for their criminal behavior. Their primary concern was avoiding consequences rather than making amends, and their attempts to manipulate my emotions demonstrated that they viewed me as a resource to be exploited rather than a daughter to be cherished. Mike found me crying in the kitchen when he returned from his shift that evening, and his immediate embrace provided the comfort and stability I needed to process the emotional devastation of that phone conversation. As I described my mother's justifications and threats, his anger on my behalf helped validate my own sense of betrayal and injustice. "Jess, what she said to you was emotional abuse designed to make you feel guilty for protecting yourself from their crimes," he said firmly. "The fact that she's still trying to manipulate you even after being caught proves that pursuing criminal charges was the right decision. These are not people who can be trusted to honor agreements or respect boundaries without legal enforcement." That night, I began the painful process of accepting that the parents I had loved and trusted my entire life were fundamentally different people than I had believed them to be. The capacity for love and the capacity for betrayal had coexisted in them all along, and their decision to prioritize their financial convenience over my security revealed which impulse was stronger when tested by difficult circumstances. Part 4. The legal battle begins. The formal arraignment of my parents took place on a gray December morning that seemed to match the somber gravity of the occasion. I sat in the gallery of Maricopa County Superior Court, watching as Bob and Linda Martinez were led into the courtroom in handcuffs to face charges of identity theft, mortgage fraud, and grand theft. The sight of them in orange jail uniforms, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I had ever seen them, created a complex mix of emotions that I was still struggling to process. Judge Patricia Williams presided over the hearing with the kind of efficient professionalism that suggested she had seen many cases like this before. As the charges were read aloud, the full scope of my parents' criminal behavior was laid out in formal legal language that made their betrayal sound both more serious and more impersonal than it felt in my daily experience of dealing with the aftermath. The defendants are charged with identity theft in the first degree, a Class 2 felony for knowingly taking the personal identifying information of Jessica Martinez for the purpose of obtaining credit. They are further charged with fraudulent schemes and artifices, a Class 2 felony, for their role in executing a scheme to defraud First National Bank through the submission of false documentation. Finally, they face charges of theft in the first degree, a Class 2 felony, for unlawfully taking property valued at more than $25,000. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Michael Chen, requested that bail be set at $50,000 each, arguing that the defendants posed a flight risk due to their access to substantial stolen funds and their demonstrated willingness to engage in sophisticated financial crimes. The defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named David Rodriguez, argued for reduced bail based on their lack of prior criminal history and their ties to the local community. Judge Williams set bail at $30,000 each, with conditions that included surrendering their passports, submitting to weekly check-ins with a probation officer, and having no contact with me except through their attorney. As the judge explained these conditions, my mother turned to look at me in the gallery, her expression a mixture of hurt and accusation that made me feel guilty despite knowing intellectually that I was the victim in this situation. The no-contact order was actually a relief, as it meant I wouldn't have to deal with continued manipulation and emotional pressure while the legal process played out. Detective Santos had warned me that many financial fraud cases involving family members become complicated by ongoing contact between victims and perpetrators, often resulting in dropped charges or reduced cooperation when family loyalty overcomes the victim's sense of justice. After the arraignment, I met with Assistant District Attorney Chen to discuss the prosecution strategy and my role as the primary witness in the case. ADA Chen was a serious man in his 30s who specialized in white-collar crimes, and his experience with family financial fraud cases provided valuable perspective on what I could expect in the coming months. The good news is that we have extremely strong evidence of their criminal activity, he explained as we sat in his office reviewing case files. The forged signatures, the bank surveillance footage, the pattern of financial transactions, all of this creates a compelling case that will be difficult for the defense to challenge effectively. The more complicated aspect will be the emotional dynamics that come into play when family members testify against each other. He explained that defense attorneys in family fraud cases often try to paint the victim as vindictive or the charges as arising from family disputes rather than genuine criminal behavior. They might argue that I had actually given my parents permission to use my information, or that the loan was part of some informal family financial arrangement that had gone wrong rather than a deliberate theft. Your parents' attorney will likely try to present character evidence about their years of good parenting and community involvement, ADA Chen continued. They'll want the jury to see this as a desperate mistake by otherwise good people rather than calculated criminal behavior. That's why your testimony about the planning and deception will be so important. It establishes that this wasn't an impulsive act but a sophisticated fraud. The prospect of testifying against my parents in open court felt almost overwhelming. I would have to sit in front of a jury of strangers and detail the most painful betrayal of my life, while my parents and their attorney tried to discredit my account and minimize their criminal behavior. The adversarial nature of the process seemed to guarantee that any remaining family relationships would be destroyed completely. ADA Chen was sensitive to these concerns, but also clear about the importance of my cooperation in achieving justice. I understand that this is incredibly difficult for you emotionally, he said with genuine sympathy. But you need to remember that your parents made the choice to commit these crimes. The consequences they're facing are the result of their decisions, not yours. Your responsibility is to tell the truth about what happened to you, and let the legal system determine the appropriate consequences. The weeks following the arraignment were filled with depositions, document review sessions, and meetings with various legal professionals as the prosecution built their case. I found myself spending hours in law offices and government buildings, recounting the same painful details repeatedly as investigators and attorneys gathered evidence and prepared for trial. One of the most difficult aspects of this process was learning about the full extent of my parents' financial deception. The forensic accountant hired by the prosecution discovered that their gambling and credit card debts were even more substantial than initially suspected. Dad had been borrowing money from loan sharks and illegal gambling operations, accumulating debts that came with threats of violence if not repaid quickly. Mom had been using multiple credit cards under different names, creating a web of financial obligations that they had hidden from each other as well as from me. This information helped explain the desperation that had driven them to commit such a brazen crime against their own daughter, but it also revealed the depth of their deception and the extent to which they had been living double lives. The parents I thought I knew, responsible, hard-working, honest people, had been engaging in destructive financial behaviors for years while maintaining a facade of stability and respectability. The forensic accountant also traced the movement of my stolen loan proceeds through various accounts and investments. While some of the money had been used to pay off legitimate debts, a significant portion had been invested in high-risk cryptocurrency and penny stock schemes that had lost substantial value within weeks of purchase. My parents' poor financial judgment had not only led them to steal from me, but had also resulted in the loss of much of the stolen money through reckless speculation. The irony is devastating, explained the accountant during one of our review sessions. They stole money secured by your house to escape their financial problems, then immediately made investment decisions that eliminated most of the proceeds while leaving you liable for the full amount of the fraudulent loan. Their desperation to get rich quick compounded the harm they caused you exponentially. This revelation added another layer of fury to my already complex emotions about the situation. Not only had my parents stolen from me, but they had been so financially irresponsible with the proceeds that recovery of the funds would be extremely difficult. Their poor judgment had essentially converted my home equity into gambling losses and worthless investments while leaving me legally responsible for a loan I had never authorized. Meanwhile, the impact on my daily life was becoming increasingly severe. The uncertainty about my house created constant anxiety that affected my work performance and personal relationships. I couldn't make long-term plans or consider major purchases while the legal and financial resolution remained unclear. The stress was manifesting in physical symptoms including insomnia, loss of appetite, and persistent headaches that made concentrating on anything else nearly impossible. Mike had become my primary source of emotional support, but I could see the strain this situation was placing on our relationship as well. His natural protective instincts made him angry about what my parents had done, and his frustration with the slow pace of legal proceedings sometimes created tension between us when I needed calm reassurance rather than shared outrage. "I know you're trying to help," I told him one evening after he had spent an hour ranting about the inadequacy of the criminal justice system, "but sometimes I need you to just listen and be supportive rather than being angry on my behalf. I have enough anger of my own to deal with." His immediate apology and adjustment of his approach reminded me why our relationship had weathered this crisis so well. Mike's willingness to recognize when his help wasn't helpful, and to modify his behavior based on my actual needs rather than his assumptions about what I needed, demonstrated the kind of genuine partnership that made facing this ordeal bearable. The first major legal victory came in February, when Judge Williams granted our motion to freeze all assets that could be traced to the proceeds of the fraudulent loan. This court order prevented my parents from dissipating any remaining funds while the criminal case proceeded, and it also established a legal foundation for eventual restitution regardless of the outcome of the criminal charges. ADHN explained that this asset freeze was crucial for my long-term financial recovery. "Even if we secure criminal convictions, getting your money back depends on there being recoverable assets available for restitution," he said. "By freezing these accounts now, we're preserving whatever funds still exist and preventing your parents from hiding or spending the remaining proceeds." The asset freeze also had the practical effect of forcing my parents to confront the financial reality of their situation more directly. With their access to the stolen funds cut off, they had to rely on their limited legitimate income to pay for housing, food, and legal representation. This financial pressure led to the first crack in their united front against the charges. Mom's attorney contacted ADHN in March to discuss a potential plea agreement that would involve her cooperation against Dad in exchange for reduced charges. According to the attorney, Mom was claiming that Dad had been the primary architect of the fraud scheme, and that she had participated only under pressure and with limited understanding of the legal implications. This kind of finger-pointing is common in cases involving co-defendants. ADHN explained when he called to inform me of this development. Each defendant's attorney tries to minimize their client's culpability by emphasizing the other defendant's role. We need to be careful about accepting any plea agreements that don't accurately reflect both defendants' levels of responsibility. The idea that Mom might try to portray herself as a victim of Dad's manipulation was both predictable and infuriating. The bank surveillance footage clearly showed both of them participating willingly in transactions involving the stolen money, and the evidence suggested that they had planned and executed the fraud together. Mom's attempt to escape responsibility by claiming coercion was just another example of their refusal to accept accountability for their choices. However, ADHN also explained that Mom's cooperation could be valuable for securing Dad's conviction and understanding the full scope of their criminal activities. If she was willing to testify about the planning process, the document forgery, and the use of the stolen funds, her testimony could provide important details that would be difficult to establish through physical evidence alone. The challenge is determining whether her cooperation is genuine or whether it's just another manipulation designed to minimize her own consequences. We'll need to verify any information she provides against the physical evidence and other witness statements before we consider any plea agreements. The prospect of my parents turning against each other added yet another painful dimension to an already devastating situation. Not only had they betrayed me, but they were now betraying each other in an attempt to escape the consequences of their joint criminal enterprise. The family unity that had once been a source of strength and identity was completely shattered, replaced by self-interested maneuvering and mutual recrimination. This development also created additional complexity for my own testimony and involvement in the case. If Mom became a prosecution witness against Dad, I might find myself in the surreal position of being allied with one parent against the other in a criminal proceeding. The emotional implications of this scenario were almost too complex to process, involving layers of loyalty, betrayal, and justice that seemed impossible to reconcile. April brought another significant development when Dad's attorney filed a motion claiming that his client was suffering from gambling addiction and other mental health issues that had impaired his judgment during the period when the fraud was committed. This motion requested a mental health evaluation and suggested that addiction-related mental illness should be considered as a mitigating factor in sentencing. While gambling addiction is a legitimate mental health condition that can impair decision-making, this defense strategy felt like another attempt to avoid responsibility for criminal behavior. Dad had been functioning normally in all other aspects of his life during the period when he was planning and executing the fraud. He had maintained his job, managed other financial obligations, and interacted with family members without showing signs of mental incapacity. Addiction doesn't excuse criminal behavior, especially complex fraud that requires planning and deception over extended periods. ADHN explained when I expressed frustration with this defense strategy. The law recognizes that people with addictions can still be held responsible for crimes they commit, particularly when those crimes victimize family members or other vulnerable individuals. The mental health evaluation was conducted by a court-appointed psychiatrist who interviewed Dad extensively and reviewed his medical and financial records. The resulting report acknowledged that Dad suffered from gambling disorder and depression, but concluded that these conditions did not significantly impair his ability to understand the wrongfulness of his actions or to conform his behavior to legal requirements. This psychiatric evaluation became another piece of evidence that highlighted the calculated nature of my parents' crime. Rather than acting impulsively under the influence of mental illness, they had planned and executed a sophisticated fraud, while understanding perfectly well that their actions were illegal and harmful. The evaluation actually strengthened the prosecution's case by establishing that their criminal behavior was the result of choice rather than incapacity. Meanwhile, the civil aspects of my case were proceeding through separate legal channels. My attorney had filed a lawsuit against my parents seeking full restitution for the stolen funds, plus damages for the emotional distress and financial harm caused by their actions. This civil case would proceed regardless of the outcome of the criminal charges, and it provided an additional avenue for recovering my losses. The civil discovery process revealed even more disturbing details about my parents' financial situation and their planning for the fraud. Email records recovered from their computer showed months of research into home equity loan procedures, identity theft techniques, and methods for concealing fraudulent transactions. These communications demonstrated a level of premeditation that made their crime even more shocking and deliberate. One particularly painful email exchange showed them discussing whether I would figure out what they had done and how long they might have before I discovered the unauthorized loan. Another message included research about statute of limitations periods for financial fraud, suggesting that they had considered the possibility of being caught and were planning strategies for minimizing legal consequences. These communications are devastating evidence for their criminal defense, my civil attorney explained. They show clear intent to defraud, sophisticated planning, and conscious awareness that their actions were criminal. No jury will be able to view this as a desperate mistake or momentary lapse in judgment. Reading these emails was emotionally devastating in a way that even the financial theft had not been. Seeing my parents discuss me as a target to be exploited, rather than a daughter to be protected, forced me to confront the reality that their love for me had been conditional and self-serving. They had been willing to destroy my financial security and emotional well-being to solve problems they had created through their own poor choices. The spring months also brought pressure from extended family members who had learned about the criminal charges and were struggling to understand how the situation had reached this point. My father's brother called repeatedly, trying to convince me to drop the charges and work things out as a family rather than involving the legal system. Several cousins sent messages expressing disbelief that I would turn against my parents during their time of need. These family pressures were particularly difficult because they reflected the same misplaced loyalty that I had struggled with initially. Well-meaning relatives who hadn't been victimized themselves couldn't understand why I wouldn't simply forgive and forget, especially since my parents were now facing serious legal consequences that would affect their entire future. "You have to understand," my uncle explained during one particularly tense phone conversation, "your parents made a mistake, but they're still your parents. Family is supposed to forgive and support each other through difficult times. Sending them to prison won't get your money back, but it will destroy any chance of rebuilding your relationship." The assumption that I should prioritize family reconciliation over personal justice was frustrating and hurtful. These relatives seemed to believe that being victimized by family members created an obligation to minimize the harm and protect the perpetrators from consequences. They couldn't understand that accountability was actually a prerequisite for any genuine reconciliation, and that enabling criminal behavior would only encourage future victimization. Mike's perspective on these family pressures was invaluable in helping me maintain clarity about my choices. "Your uncle and cousins weren't the ones who had their houses put at risk by fraud," he pointed out. "It's easy for them to advocate forgiveness when they haven't experienced the violation and betrayal that you've endured. Their opinions about what you should do don't carry much weight when they haven't walked in your shoes." His support helped me recognize that my extended family's pressure was based on their own discomfort with conflict and their desire to return to familiar family dynamics, rather than on genuine concern for justice or my well-being. They wanted me to absorb the harm and move on so that everyone else could feel comfortable again, without considering whether that approach would actually serve my long-term interests. The emotional toll of maintaining boundaries with well-meaning but misguided family members was significant, but it was also important preparation for the psychological challenges I would face during the trial itself. Learning to prioritize my own need for justice over other people's comfort with my choices was essential for surviving the public nature of criminal proceedings, where family loyalty would be questioned and judged by strangers. By late spring, it became clear that the case would proceed to trial rather than being resolved through plea agreements. Dad's attorney had rejected the prosecution's plea offer, apparently believing that they could convince a jury that his gambling addiction excused or mitigated his criminal behavior. Mom's attorney was still negotiating for a cooperation agreement, but Ada Chen remained skeptical about the value of her testimony given her obvious motivation to minimize her own involvement. "We're prepared to proceed to trial against both defendants if necessary," Ada Chen informed me during one of our preparation sessions. "The evidence is strong enough to secure convictions without relying on either defendant's testimony against the other. Your testimony, combined with the physical evidence and financial records, creates a compelling case that any reasonable jury should be able to understand." The prospect of trial was both frightening and empowering. It would require me to face my parents in a public forum and describe their betrayal in detail, but it would also provide an opportunity for the full truth to be heard and acknowledged. After months of legal maneuvering and family pressure, the trial would finally focus on the fundamental questions of what my parents had done and what consequences their actions deserved. As summer approached, I began the intensive preparation process that would ready me to testify effectively and handle the emotional challenges of confronting my parents in court. This preparation would test not only my factual knowledge of events, but also my psychological resilience and my commitment to seeing justice served regardless of the personal cost. Part 4. The confrontation in court. The trial began on a sweltering Monday morning in July, with temperatures already reaching over 100 degrees by the time I arrived at the Maricopa County Superior Court building. The oppressive heat seemed to match the weight of the moment as I walked through the security checkpoints and metal detectors, knowing that this day would force me to confront my parents publicly and relive the most painful betrayal of my life in front of strangers who would judge not only the facts of the case but also the family dynamics that had led to this devastating situation. Judge Patricia Williams' courtroom was filled with potential jurors, court personnel, and a few curious observers who had been drawn by the unusual nature of a case involving financial fraud between family members. The jury selection process took most of the morning, with attorneys from both sides questioning potential jurors about their attitudes toward family loyalty, financial responsibility, and the circumstances under which they might prosecute their own relatives. ADA Chen used his questioning to identify jurors who could separate emotional sympathy from legal facts, emphasizing that the case would require them to evaluate criminal behavior objectively, regardless of the family relationships involved. The defense attorneys focused on finding jurors who might be sympathetic to parents facing financial difficulties, and who might view the charges as an overreaction to what they characterized as a family financial dispute. I sat in the gallery during jury selection, trying to avoid making eye contact with my parents at the defendant's table while simultaneously studying their appearance and demeanor. They looked smaller and more fragile than I remembered, dressed in conservative business attire that their attorneys had undoubtedly selected to create a favorable impression. Mom appeared to have lost weight and aged significantly since their arrest, while Dad's usually confident posture had been replaced by a hunched, defeated appearance. The final jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from their late 20s to early 60s, representing a cross-section of Phoenix area residents with various professional and personal backgrounds. Judge Williams spent considerable time instructing them about their responsibilities, emphasizing that they must base their verdict solely on the evidence presented rather than on sympathy or personal feelings about family relationships. ADA Chen's opening statement was methodical and devastating, laying out the timeline of my parents' fraud in precise detail while emphasizing the planning and deception that had made their crime possible. He described the months of preparation, the forged signatures, the careful timing of their actions, and the sophisticated cover-up that followed the theft of my home equity. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he concluded, this case is not about a family financial disagreement or desperate parents making a momentary mistake. This is about calculated criminal fraud committed by 2 individuals who deliberately chose to violate their daughter's trust and steal her financial security for their own benefit. The evidence will show that Bob and Linda Martinez are not victims of circumstances. They are criminals who victimized their own child. Dad's attorney, David Rodriguez, presented an opening statement that acknowledged the basic facts of the case while arguing for sympathy based on his client's gambling addiction and the financial pressures that had driven him to make poor decisions. He portrayed Dad as a hardworking man who had provided for his family for decades before succumbing to an illness that had impaired his judgment and led to desperate actions. Bob Martinez is not a career criminal or a sophisticated fraudster, Rodriguez argued. He is a father and husband who worked construction for 30 years, who raised a successful daughter, and who made terrible choices when faced with debts and threats that seemed insurmountable. His actions were wrong, but they were the actions of a sick man in crisis, not a calculating predator. Mom's attorney, Sarah Johnson, took a different approach, arguing that her client had been manipulated and coerced by Dad into participating in activities she didn't fully understand. This strategy attempted to portray Mom as another victim of Dad's addiction and desperation, someone who had been drawn into criminal activity through emotional manipulation rather than her own criminal intent. Linda Martinez trusted her husband to handle their family's financial affairs, just as she had for their entire marriage. Johnson told the jury, When Bob told her they needed her help with paperwork and banking transactions, she didn't realize she was participating in fraud. She was a wife trying to support her husband through a difficult time, not a criminal conspirator planning to steal from her daughter. The opening statements established the battle lines for a trial that would focus not only on the facts of the fraud but also on competing narratives about responsibility, mental illness, and family dynamics. The prosecution needed to prove deliberate criminal intent by both defendants, while the defense attorneys sought to minimize their client's culpability through claims of addiction, coercion, and family loyalty. My testimony was scheduled for the second day of trial, and I spent the evening before reviewing my statement with Ada Chen and practicing responses to the types of questions I could expect from defense attorneys. The preparation was emotionally exhausting, requiring me to anticipate challenges to my credibility, my motivations for prosecution, and my relationship with my parents. Remember that their attorneys will try to make you seem vindictive or ungrateful. Ada Chen reminded me. They may ask about your parents' years of support and sacrifice, suggesting that prosecuting them shows a lack of appreciation for everything they did for you. Stay focused on the facts of what they did, not on their history as parents or their current legal troubles. The morning of my testimony, I arrived at court early and spent time in the Victim Services office, where a counselor helped me practice relaxation techniques and mental preparation strategies for the stress of public testimony. The counselor, Maria Gonzalez, had extensive experience helping crime victims navigate the court system, and her practical advice was invaluable for managing my anxiety. Testifying against family members is one of the most difficult things a person can do, she explained. Your emotions may be conflicted, and that's completely normal. Focus on telling the truth clearly and simply, and remember that you're not responsible for the consequences your parents face, they are responsible for the choices that led them here. When I was called to testify, the walk from the gallery to the witness stand felt longer than any journey I had ever taken. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on me, including my parents, who looked directly at me for the first time since their arrest. Mom's expression was pleading and desperate, while Dad's face showed a mixture of anger and resignation that made maintaining eye contact difficult. Ada Chen began with basic questions about my background and relationship with my parents, establishing the foundation of trust that had made their fraud possible. I described our close family bond, their support during my military service and college years, and their involvement in helping me purchase my house. This testimony was important for showing the jury that my parents had held a position of special trust that they had violated for criminal purposes. The emotional weight of describing our positive relationship while knowing how it had ended was almost overwhelming. These were real memories of love and support that had shaped my entire life, and acknowledging them publicly while my parents sat at the defendant's table created a painful cognitive dissonance that made speaking clearly difficult. Did there come a time when you became aware that your parents had taken out a loan using your house as collateral? Ada Chen asked, transitioning to the core facts of the case. Yes, I replied, my voice steadier than I had expected. I received a call from Jennifer Hayes, at First National Bank in November, telling me about a home equity loan I had never applied for or authorized. I walked the jury through the discovery process, describing my shock at learning about the loan, my investigation into the fraud, and the gradual realization that my parents had to be responsible based on their access to my personal information and documents. The testimony was factual and chronological, but I could see some jurors reacting emotionally to the description of my parents' betrayal. The most difficult part of my direct testimony involved describing the forged signatures and the evidence of planning that investigators had discovered. Showing the jury examples of my real signature, compared to the forged versions, required me to acknowledge that someone who knew me intimately had practiced copying my handwriting for the purpose of stealing from me. When you saw these forged signatures, how did that make you feel? Ada Chen asked. Violated, I answered honestly. Someone had spent time studying my handwriting and practicing my signature for the specific purpose of stealing from me. It felt like a very personal violation of my identity and my trust. Defense cross-examination began with Dad's attorney attempting to portray my prosecution decision as vindictive and disproportionate to the harm I had suffered. Rodriguez asked detailed questions about my parents' years of support and sacrifice, clearly trying to make me appear ungrateful and cold-hearted for seeking criminal prosecution rather than family reconciliation. Ms. Martinez, your parents spent thousands of dollars supporting your education and helping you establish your adult life, didn't they? Rodriguez asked. Yes, they did, I replied. And when they made their mistake and took out this loan, they didn't spend the money on luxury items or vacations. They used it to pay debts and try to improve their financial situation, correct? They used stolen money to pay gambling debts and make risky investments, I corrected. The fact that they had debts doesn't justify stealing from their daughter to pay them. Rodriguez continued this line of questioning for nearly an hour, repeatedly characterizing the fraud as a mistake, and suggesting that my decision to involve law enforcement was an overreaction motivated by anger rather than genuine harm. His strategy was clearly to make the jury see me as a heartless daughter who was destroying her parents' lives over money that could be repaid through less drastic means. ADA Chen's redirect examination gave me the opportunity to clarify the emotional and financial impact of my parents' actions, emphasizing that the harm went far beyond the monetary value of the stolen funds. I described the destruction of trust, the anxiety about potentially losing my house, and the emotional devastation of learning that my parents had been planning to victimize me for months while maintaining normal family relationships. The money is important, I concluded, but the betrayal of trust and the violation of our family relationship is something that can't be repaid or easily forgiven. They looked me in the eye for weeks while they were stealing from me, and that level of deception has changed how I understand our entire relationship. Mom's attorney chose not to cross-examine me extensively, apparently recognizing that aggressive questioning of the victim might backfire with jurors who were already sympathetic to my situation. Her brief questions focused on establishing that Mom had been less involved in the planning and execution of the fraud, consistent with their strategy of portraying her as Dad's reluctant accomplice. The remainder of the prosecution case consisted of testimony from bank employees, police investigators, and the forensic accountant who had traced the movement of stolen funds. This testimony was technical but devastating, providing detailed evidence of the planning and sophistication that had gone into my parents' crime. Jennifer Hayes from First National Bank testified about the loan application process and the documentation that had been submitted, emphasizing that the fraud had been sophisticated enough to pass the bank's standard verification procedures. Detective Santos described the investigation process and the evidence of premeditation that had been discovered through computer searches and financial record analysis. The forensic accountant's testimony was particularly damaging to the defense, as it showed exactly how the stolen money had been used, and highlighted the poor financial decisions that had motivated the original theft. The jury learned about Dad's gambling debts, Mom's credit card problems, and the risky investments that had eliminated much of the stolen money within weeks of the theft. In your professional opinion, ADA Chen asked the accountant, was this fraud motivated by immediate financial crisis, or was it part of a longer pattern of poor financial decision-making? Based on the financial records I reviewed, the accountant replied, the defendants had been making increasingly risky financial decisions for several years before committing this fraud. The theft appears to have been motivated by a desire to continue gambling and speculative investing rather than by genuine financial hardship. The defense case began with character witnesses who testified about my parents' years of community involvement and their reputation as loving, supportive people. Former neighbors, co-workers, and family friends described Dad's work ethic and Mom's kindness, clearly trying to convince the jury that the fraud was completely out of character and represented a temporary lapse rather than their true nature. These character witnesses were effective in humanizing my parents and reminding the jury that they were complex people with positive qualities, not cartoon villains who had set out to harm their daughter. However, ADA Chen's cross-examination established that none of these witnesses had been aware of my parents' financial problems or gambling issues, suggesting that their positive character assessments were based on incomplete information. Dad's testimony on his own behalf was the most emotionally difficult part of the trial for me to watch. He described his gambling addiction, his mounting debts, and the desperation that had led him to make what he characterized as the worst decision of his life. His remorse appeared genuine, and his testimony was clearly designed to generate sympathy from jurors who might identify with someone facing overwhelming financial pressure. I know what I did was wrong, Dad testified, his voice breaking with emotion. I betrayed my daughter's trust, and I've destroyed our family relationship. But I want the jury to understand that I wasn't thinking clearly. The gambling addiction had taken control of my life, and I was facing threats from people who said they would hurt my family if I didn't pay my debts. Under cross-examination, ADA Chen systematically dismantled Dad's portrayal of himself as a victim of addiction and circumstances. Through careful questioning, he established that Dad had been functioning normally in other aspects of his life, maintaining his job and family relationships, while planning and executing the fraud over a period of months. Mr. Martinez, your addiction didn't prevent you from researching loan procedures, practicing your daughter's signature, or setting up bank accounts to receive the stolen funds, did it? ADA Chen asked. No sir, Dad admitted. And your addiction didn't prevent you from lying to your daughter about your activities or maintaining normal family relationships while you were stealing from her, correct? No sir. This cross-examination was devastating because it highlighted the calculated nature of Dad's actions and demonstrated that his addiction, while real, had not impaired his ability to plan and execute complex criminal activities. The testimony actually reinforced the prosecution's argument that the fraud had been deliberate and sophisticated, rather than impulsive or illness-driven. Mom chose not to testify on her own behalf, apparently on the advice of her attorney, who feared that her involvement in the fraud was too extensive to explain away convincingly. This decision meant that the jury never heard her version of events directly, leaving her defense entirely dependent on the argument that she had been manipulated by Dad into participating in activities she didn't understand. Closing arguments brought together all the themes and evidence that had been presented during the week-long trial. ADA Chen's closing was methodical and powerful, walking the jury through the timeline of the fraud, while emphasizing the planning, deception, and sophistication that had made the crime possible. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendants want you to believe that this was a momentary mistake made by desperate parents facing financial crisis, he argued. But the evidence shows something very different. This was a calculated, sophisticated fraud planned and executed over months by two people who deliberately chose to victimize their own daughter, rather than face the consequences of their financial irresponsibility. He emphasized that addiction and financial stress, while potentially explaining motivation, could not excuse criminal behavior or justify victimizing family members. The prosecution's case had established beyond reasonable doubt that both defendants had acted with criminal intent and had violated the trust of someone who should have been able to depend on their protection rather than fear their exploitation. Defense closing arguments focused on sympathy and mitigation, asking the jury to consider the human cost of conviction rather than focusing solely on the legal facts of the case. Both attorneys acknowledged that their clients had committed wrongful acts, but argued that criminal prosecution was a disproportionate response that would destroy lives without serving any legitimate purpose. Bob Martinez made terrible decisions that he will regret for the rest of his life, Rodriguez argued. But sending a 60-year-old man to prison for mistakes made during the worst period of his life serves no one's interests. He has already lost his relationship with his daughter, his reputation in the community, and his financial security. Additional punishment through incarceration will accomplish nothing except destroying what remains of his life. Mom's attorney made similar arguments, while maintaining that her client's involvement had been minimal and coerced. Linda Martinez was a wife who trusted her husband and followed his lead during a crisis, Johnson argued. She didn't initiate this fraud, she didn't benefit from it personally, and she didn't understand the full implications of her actions. Convicting her of serious felonies would punish someone who was as much a victim of Bob's poor judgment as anyone else. The jury deliberated for 6 hours over 2 days before reaching their verdict. The foreman stood to announce their decision on a Friday afternoon, with the courtroom packed with family members, legal professionals, and media representatives who had followed the case. I sat between Mike and Sarah Chen, gripping their hands as I prepared to learn whether months of legal proceedings had resulted in justice or disappointment. On the charge of identity theft in the first degree against defendant Robert Martinez, we find the defendant guilty, the foreman announced. The same verdict followed for the charges of fraudulent schemes and theft in the first degree. Dad's conviction on all counts felt like a validation of everything I had endured during the investigation and trial process. Mom's verdicts were more mixed, reflecting the jury's apparent acceptance of some aspects of her diminished culpability defense. She was found guilty of identity theft and fraudulent schemes, but not guilty of theft in the first degree. The partial acquittal suggested that the jury had found her involvement less extensive than Dad's, but still sufficient to warrant serious criminal consequences. Judge Williams scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, giving the probation department time to prepare pre-sentence reports, and allowing both sides to submit mitigation or victim impact evidence. As the verdicts were read and the defendants were led away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and closure that was difficult to process emotionally. The trial had achieved its primary purpose of establishing legal accountability for my parents' crimes, but it had also finalized the destruction of family relationships that had once been central to my identity and happiness. Justice had been served, but the cost had been enormous for everyone involved, including family members who had committed no crimes, but would live with the consequences of this betrayal for years to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.